Hello and welcome to the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, I'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week. This week, Donald Trump, the first U.S. president to be ruled a felon.
Not being pro or anti-Trump, but simply being in favor of responsibility and in favor that no American, even Donald Trump, should be above the law in an election year.
Plus, the exciting world of Korean cuisine.
There are so many great bubbling bowls and cauldrons of, jjigaes, we call them, that hug you back and really warm you from the inside. And there are so many regional delicacies. So yeah, we've only just scratched the surface, of Korean food.
All that and much more in the next hour here on The Curator with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And of course, we start the show talking about Donald Trump, former president, current candidate, and now convicted criminal. He becomes the first president in U.S. history to be found guilty on multiple criminal charges. We'll assess a significant moment in America's history. To discuss more, let's hear from Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and Monocle's Chris Chamak.
The fact that we have this very factual, this point to say, yes, he has been convicted of a crime, the first president in history, the legal system worked. What you have, though, here in the United States at the moment is this divide between the politics and the legal, which is quite incredible, just also in terms of the rules, right, of how the U.S. is set up. The fact that a convicted felon in the United States can still run for president. There is nothing stopping him from serving as president as well. As a result of that, this thing has been weirdly priced into politics in America. Both Donald Trump's campaign and Joe Biden's campaign, for that matter, have simply said this matter will be decided in November at the ballot box. No calls for him to step down as the Republican candidate for president. And I do think that, at least from an outside perspective, is important to note. It just shows how, when Scott is talking there about the legal system working, it shows this distinction we have right now in the U.S. between the legal system and the politics, which is completely separate from the legal system at this point. But so at the end of the day, as incredible as it sounds, despite the fact of Donald Trump now being a convicted felon, this will be decided by an election.
So what happens now, Scott?
First of all, while taking everything Chris says on board, and I'll get to that in just a minute, what happens now and what is decided now is not November's election. What happens now is that Judge One Merchant, having presided over the trial, will now take into account Trump's behavior. He'll take into account the jury's verdict. He will then impose sentence on July 11th. Each of those 34 counts, felony counts of falsifying business records, carries a sentence of up to 4 years in prison. Now, Donald Trump is not going to get 136 years in prison. Even if he got 4 years on each count, the sentences would be concurrent. In other words, he would serve a maximum of 4 years, but the sentence is quite likely to be less than that. And indeed, he may be effectively kept under house arrest or under monitoring. What will then happen beyond him being sentenced is that there will be an appeal. That appeal process will carry on even as we have the political campaign, and indeed probably beyond the election in November. So Trump will probably stay out of prison, even if the sentence was to be detention. We will then see where November's election plays out, because what will happen before November's election, and of course, if Trump gets elected, is that attempt to rip apart the legal process by precisely saying, oh, no, it doesn't matter. Only that vote in November mattered, to the extent that Donald Trump will pardon himself, if not legally, because it's disputed whether he can legally do it. He'll do it with a declaration that he is pardoned, indeed, that he is immune from any of the cases against him. And again, I return to this, that beyond this trial, as important as it is, this is the most important and possibly dangerous moment in American history since the end of the Civil War. Because it's not just a question about Trump trying to tear down the legal system. We're only 3.5 years away from him trying to tear down the entire American system with an attempted coup in January 2021, because this is the distinction. You can choose the American system, political and legal, or you can choose Donald Trump, who does not accept that system and accepts only his rule. You cannot choose both.
What happens now in terms of the way that Donald Trump plays this is bolstered enormously by the way that his defence team ran the trial, which sort of ran the trial a little bit like they ran a political campaign, which is personal attacks, denials, etc., not really playing by the rules. But there is something really important here, is that Donald Trump's supporters are furious, and he is being seen, and he sees himself as a martyr of political persecution. This could get him an awful lot of support, it could get him an awful lot of money, and it could also get him an awful lot of exposure, which Biden lacks. And we are now, I can't quite believe we're talking about the fact that the former president is a convicted felon, does not seem to be remotely affected by his conviction in terms of his attempted journey towards the White House.
Again, also importantly to note there, because it is not just his supporters as voters who are not necessarily turned off by this, although we'll get to the polls in a moment, but also his supporters in the political system. Senator J.D. Vance, for example, one case of a Republican from Ohio. When you talk about what his defense case has made in this continues now too. J.D. Vance saying last night, we need to be subpoenaing Judge Merchant and his daughter. We need to investigate how this trial was done, suggesting that George Soros was involved in this case against New York. These are the kind of claims you have from supporters of Donald Trump in the political system. The top Republicans in the House of Representatives both immediately supported Donald Trump in this case, rather than in any way questioning or suggesting the fact that they now have a convicted felon leading their party should be a problem. This is what leads to then his supporters, in terms of voters, playing this down as well. And that will be the key, I think, absolutely, going forward, how his voters see this. You did have some polling ahead of this suggesting that even up to a quarter of Donald Trump's supporters would question their support for him if he was a convicted felon. That said, because of the style of reporting, particularly about this New York case, to say, oh, well, this was not as big a deal as the other ones, there is a likelihood that even those voters are going to fall back into line as the election nears and also go into this narrative that Donald Trump is being persecuted. It should be said, though, when you say Joe Biden doesn't have any support here, Joe Biden's campaign also immediately sent out a mailing asking for donations as a result of this from Donald Trump, of the conviction. So both sides are going to be playing this. They are going to be playing to their base. They are going to be playing to the frustrations here. And not just the frustrations, I think, to Scott's broader point here, absolutely. For those who are in the anti-Trump camp, this is a seminal moment in U.S. history that is going to lead at least a certain amount of people to respond to that and get on board.
Scott, finally turning to you, this is a narrative that will dominate the run-up to the presidential election. How much will it dominate and drown out anything else that American voters need to listen to and hear about?
That's really up to the media and whether it's going to be responsible. I think your initial point is quite right, that there are a number of very, very important issues beyond Donald Trump's accountability and any convictions. Whether you talk about immigration, the economy, whether you talk about women's rights, including abortion rights, LGBT rights, climate change, foreign policy crises from the Middle East to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is a vital moment for America and indeed for the world. But the broader point, and I'll come back to this, is that if the media, is led by the nose just simply to speculate about voters over and over and over, they're being led by Trump. That's Trump's game. The idea is, look, my base will save me, whatever happens. So stop speculating on it. Stop focusing on it. Focus on the legal side of this. When you highlight J.D. Vance, who just simply is attacking the judge, attacking the judge's daughter, just like Trump did, or you highlight Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, who immediately bowed the knee and said, oh, no, this is all just political. You're playing into Trump's narrative. In other words, a message, especially to the U.S. media, do your damn job. Do your job to question, to call out those who tried to deviate, divert, and bury this process. Call out J.D. Vance for those attacks. Call out Donald Trump for those attacks. Not being pro or anti-Trump, but simply being in favor of responsibility and in favor that no American, even Donald Trump, should be above the law in an election year.
This time for the Foreign Desk Explainer, Andrew Muller explains why Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has given villages to Azerbaijan, resulting in mass protests.
A people besieged by a much mightier neighbour with whom they are at odds over religion, language, ethnicity and history. Their land separated from that of their fellow citizens by the territory of that hostile adjoining state. Entry points to their enclave blockaded, preventing commercial traffic, essential goods and humanitarian supplies alike from reaching their destination. More or less continual harassment by the military of their enemy, culminating in a brutal offensive apparently calculated to render life impossible. All of this occurring just a few hours' flight from the capitals of Europe.
It was very dangerous there. They took out everybody they could. People were fleeing in trucks, buses and cars. The gunfighting was everywhere, all the time. Not even a 5-minute break.
Last September's assault by Azerbaijan on the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh was many things, none of them good, but remains pretty hard to top as a contemporary demonstration of the selective nature of popular outrage. And that, as a general rule, people tend to allocate their anger not in particular sympathy with those being persecuted, but to express their pre-existing animus against who is doing the persecuting. In response to the complete ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, 120,000 long-beleaguered people chased out of their ancestral homeland at gunpoint, the streets and campuses of Western cities conspicuously failed to heave with protest in solidarity with its suddenly displaced population. If there were any anguished demands that multinational businesses divest their interests in Azerbaijan, they rather struggled to be heard. Nobody complained about Azerbaijan being permitted to enter the Eurovision Song Contest this year, even if, it may be safely assumed, people did complain about the quality of Azerbaijan's entry, which did not get out of the semi-finals and indeed finished second last, and deservedly. But if the vanquishing of Nagorno-Karabakh was ignored by the world at large, events this last week or so have reminded that it remains very much a live issue in Armenia.
Nikol Pashinyan,
There have been hefty and rowdy demonstrations in Armenia's capital, Yerevan, and elsewhere, following the agreement of Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan to cede control of 4 border villages in the Tavush region of Armenia's northeast to Azerbaijan. Earlier this month, Armenia and Azerbaijan announced an agreement to tweak 12.7 kilometers of their shared border, one effect of which is to return to Azeri control this quartet of settlements which were seized by Armenia from Azerbaijan during the first war the two countries fought over Nagorno-Karabakh in the early 1990s.
Our government isn't dividing, it's trying to reunite, to make the concepts of homeland and state identical, because this is the only way to establish and strengthen the Republic of Armenia.
Prime Minister Pashinyan's explanation is that this demarcation, based on maps drawn back when both countries were Soviet socialist republics, clarifies the notoriously higgledy-piggledy border and thereby reduces the prospect of further conflict between the two countries. Conflict for which Armenia, smaller, poorer and much less well-armed than its oil-sodden antagonist, is ill-prepared. Put that way, a handful of hamlets seems a pretty trivial concession. There are, however, Armenians who would put it another way. The village of Kirants has been a particular flashpoint. The new border assigns 54 plots of land owned by 36 villages, 2 homes and 1 shop in or around Kirants to Azerbaijan. Those Armenians who will have to move have been promised compensation by Armenia's government, but have not been told how much. Those remaining are concerned that the local school is now uncomfortably close to what seems unlikely to be an entirely tension-free border, and that they may lose access to a vital highway to Georgia. At least one vexed villager has attempted to burn his own land in preference to handing it over to an Azeri. To all of which is added the understandable fury of those who believe that a cause in which they fought and for which comrades died has been betrayed. Objections to the handover are being led by a local cleric, Archbishop Bagrat Galstanian, presently primate of the Diocese of Tavush, whose previous biggest impact on the world stage was mustering a children's choir which performed a medley of Queen songs at a science festival. Galstanian is beginning to pull Queen-sized crowds of his own at rallies in Yerevan, at which he has accused Prime Minister Pashinyan of selling the villagers out and demanding his resignation. Given that Pashinyan became Prime Minister himself largely by holding rallies in Yerevan and demanding the resignation of the previous Prime Minister, this may be causing Pashinyan an amount of nervousness. Galstanian has indeed announced that he is pausing his priesthood to seek the premiership, despite the fact that, as a dual citizen also holding a Canadian passport, he is constitutionally ineligible. Galstanian and his aggrieved supporters are unlikely to be sympathetic, but Pashinyan has not been negotiating with Azerbaijan from a position of strength. Quite aside from Armenia being obviously overmatched and outgunned by Azerbaijan, it can no longer rely, to the extent it ever could, on its traditional patron and protector Russia, with whom, rather to Pashinyan's credit, Armenia has recently fallen out. Indeed, Pashinyan has said he wants Russia out. The Russian peacekeepers who were deployed to Nagorno-Karabakh following a flare-up in 2020 were notably idle when Nagorno-Karabakh was subsequently laid siege and finally stormed. Russia has in recent weeks begun withdrawing the FSB border guards stationed along the frontier. It has been unsurprisingly and probably not outrageously speculated that Russia is cranking the present discontent up, possibly via Robert Kocharyan, former president of Armenia and close personal friend of President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Kocharyan suggested as recently as 2021 that Armenia should embrace what he called full-fledged integration with Russia. Pashinyan, for his part, seems wistfully keen to pivot west. Armenia has ceased contributing to Russia's NATO analogue, the CSTO, held drills with US troops, and sent aid to Ukraine. Pashinyan has pondered out loud applying to join the EU one day. However, this, to understate matters audaciously, is a long-term prospect. Pashinyan's extremely near-term problem is that it is hard for any national leader to lose a war or appease an enemy and look good doing it, however limited your realistic options were and however sensible a compromise you may have reached. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
We are back with a highlight from our show Monocle on Saturday now. The Helsinki-based Cozy is an independent publisher whose lifestyle books on topics ranging from Finnish design and cuisine to knitting and gardening have found a loyal fan base in the Nordic countries. Featuring elegant graphic design, stunning photography and well-curated content, Cozy's books are a celebration of print and everything that is great about books. Monocle's Helsinki correspondent Petri Burtsov met with Cozy Publishing art director Viola Minerva Virtamo, and he brings us this report.
As the name suggests, Cozy Publishing's books invoke that warm and cozy feeling inside of us that the Danes call hygge. They're the kind of books that instantly put you in a good mood, books that you should enjoy with a warm tea in hand, lounging on the sofa in candlelight, or idling away in a summer garden. Known for their beautiful photography and graphic design, Cozy's books don't fall under any clearly definable category, such as design books or cookbooks, but focus instead on topics that make life more enjoyable. In the 10 years since its launch, Cozy has published dozens of books on topics such as gardening, cooking, knitting, Nordic living, Finnish design, and the magic of the Finnish sauna, to name just a few examples. The publisher has found a loyal fan base, and you are guaranteed to find at least one Cozy book on the coffee tables of most well-designed and beautiful Helsinki homes. To better understand what Cozy's publishing philosophy is and why we need independent publishing houses like it, I ventured into Cozy Publishing's office in Helsinki's Ullanlinna neighborhood, where I met with the art director Viola Minerva Virtamo. I began by asking her about the process of choosing the topic and the visuals for a new book.
Usually authors come to us with their topics, and I think that's what makes the book good, because it's something that the person has actually think about for years making. It's not something that we sell, that we want to make a book about this thing because it's now trendy. It's something that the person has been interested in for years, something they've learned for years, and I think that's what makes the content actually really, really good. The theme has to be timeless, the content has to be something that can be used after years, but also with the design, I think it comes quite naturally. I think my style is kind of classic, and I don't like to use a lot of trendy colors. I think it comes really easily for us.
Speaking of the visuals, I mean things like typefaces and photography. I want to know more about your philosophy when it comes to those things.
We don't have a specific kind of rules for photography or fonts what we want to use, but usually I do most of our book designs, and I think it comes really easily for me. I'm a photographer. And then when I've done photography for like 8 years, then at some point I realized that I also want to do the graphic design, because I already had in my mind the design, what I wanted to look like. And we usually start with the photography when we do the layout design, which I think is kind of different to what most of the graphic designers do. I start always with the photography, and I pick the pictures first, and then I start to find the fonts and all the other design parts of the book, and want to make it look a really good, coherent piece.
In our digital age, picking up a book is always a conscious act. It's not something that just comes up on your feed as you're scrolling, but instead you make a deliberate choice to read it. According to Virtamo, Cozy's goal is to reward the reader for having made that choice.
I love to see people pick up the book and it makes them smile, it makes them really want to buy it, and that's also the reason we sell a lot in lifestyle stores. We mostly outside of Finland, we don't sell in bookstores, we sell in lifestyle stores, and it's already something that the person comes into the store and they want to be in that specific mood, usually something really Nordic and Scandinavian, and then they find our book and it's something that's similar to the pieces around that, and I think that's really important for us. We don't really believe to the death of print, even though that's something that people talk about a lot, because I think even more and more during these days people need something more than screen time. For example, with the recipes, you can find any recipe by Googling. Yeah, you can Google anything, but still people really need the book where someone has really kind of gathered all the good content, someone has tested the recipes. It's kind of a promise that someone really stands behind this book and its contents. And I believe people want something more than just having their phone or laptop with them in the kitchen or all around with them all the time. So I don't believe that book is dying. I actually believe that it's going to grow back even more. And even though the phone has taken some space from books, I think it's actually going backwards at some point.
Virtamo is convinced that the world needs independent publishers, people who care about books out of passion.
I think it's the same as with all kind of business, that it's really important to have small businesses within all big companies, because even though, of course, we are business, we need to make money, but still we are not making this for money, and we focus on design. We do this because we are passionate about books, and we are not constantly only thinking about growing and saving money, and we don't just look at the numbers. We want to make beautiful design products, and this is passion for us. So I think, like in all kind of business, it's really good that there are still small companies, and I hope that small companies still keep fighting back with the big ones.
A busy week here at Monocle Radio. This week we've also been broadcasting live from Hong Kong, from the Asian Investment Conference presented by UBS. One of our guests was Martin Yule, Head of APAC Research for UBS.
One of the things that our investing clients are seeking to do is to see thousands of companies every year. So obviously it's a lot more efficient for us to put on a conference like this and have literally thousands of equity clients come in and see 300 companies at once, as opposed to putting a lot of shoe leather to work and actually going out and seeing those companies. So there's an efficiency angle to it. The second thing is that the companies themselves want to meet new investors, and this is an avenue for them to broaden their relationships, and it's that melting pot, and things happen by osmosis when you put a lot of smart people together with ideas and capital, basically.
A lot of smart people, and I'm here as well. But it's funny, we were talking before we started the programme about a little bit of the serendipity of those meetings, and there's something I guess you can't design or know about that, but it is an amazing thing when you get all these people together in a room or in a grand hotel like this.
Yeah, no, live example was I did a panel yesterday on the brain, and this is sort of looking at brain-computer interfaces, but also some of the progression you've seen in GLP-1 drugs, etc. And just out of that, we had Amy Cruz. Amy is an investor, and she's an investor in that sort of leading-edge technology. And we had a vast array of clients come up to her after the session and press their business cards in her hand and say, we'd love to hear more from you and see opportunities. So it's absolutely a forum where people are going to meet, see new ideas, see new thematics, and that's the key.
One of the clever devices, I think, of this conference in particular is this overlay of some quite specific micro themes looking at mental health and well-being and that interface with tech, as you described, and then the necessary macro coverage. And that's not they're not always easy bedfellows, but it seems to have hung together very elegantly. I don't know what you think.
Well, look, I think Neil's done a great job in curating the content, without doubt. I'd also say that our investors are looking for a number of things at these events. They're looking for the latest thinking of experts on the key questions that investors are facing. Who's going to win the US election? What's going to happen to inflation? What's going to be the ramifications of a potential change in government in the US for the APAC audience? These types of big questions are obviously on their minds. We also want to find questions that aren't on their minds. In other words, what are going to be the investment themes that emerge over the next couple of years? And that's sessions like the one on the brain. It's the thematics around cities. The point being that we want to identify thematics that are going to affect the stock market in time. And if we're ahead of the curve there, we're providing a service to clients, they're going to make money from those thematics.
And Martin, I know you've been a busy man already, but you've got this panel which is to sort of summarise a little bit of the learnings from the piece, which is tricky to do while it's still kind of going on.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a little bit about, takeaways. You talked about some of them already. What kinds of things might you be discussing when you look to try and summarise all of these different strands that have come together?
Yeah, well, Tom, the panel is a number of our most senior clients, CIOs of major investing institutions. So these people come to a conference like this with a lens of, okay, what direction is the market going to head from here? Am I confident about the earnings outlook for my companies? And at some level, what are other themes that are going to grip the audience over time? I'd say that there's a fairly clear consensus that right now, if the US election were to happen today, would probably be a Trump victory. I think there's an emerging consensus, frankly, that that might not be the worst thing in the world for APAC. Those outside the US tend to think that well, I suppose I won't go too heavily into the politics here, Tom, but suffice it to say that I think the rest of the world sort of looks at the US with a bit of a eyebrow raised. But the conclusion, I think, of the conference is that there are a lot of Trump-like policies which actually won't be that bad for APAC. So that's a tick. China is a big swing factor. The Chinese market's about half the level it was at the peak of 2021, as recently as that. It's had a nice rally. Can it move another 15 or 20% up? Well, given how far it's fallen, probably, right? So people are looking for incremental data points on earnings out of Chinese companies and what those companies are saying about the consumer in China, more specifically. So, we'd like to think that this conference has been timely because there's some uncertainty out there, quite a lot of uncertainty, probably more uncertainty than investors are typically comfortable with. But the views of 300 companies reporting back live from being on the ground in China gives us the opportunity to sort of see what bubbles up from the bottom. And I expect our panel will be saying that, they're seeing some tentative signs of optimism, which is great.
And on the Entrepreneurs this week, Edwin Brenningmeier discusses the history and versatility of the Pilatus PC-12, highlighting the Swiss quality, diligent manufacturing process and its ability to serve as both utility and executive transport.
My philosophy has always been, I love being entrepreneurial and creating something different. But if you can start from a sort of more secure and solid foundation, that just gives you a good platform from which you can be more entrepreneurial and grow, and that de-risks it somewhat. So for me, that the starting with Pilatus, so a big Swiss manufacturer of business aviation aircraft, was a fantastic way. I mean, yes, it was a risk because, we do purchase aircraft from the manufacturer. So we're not just an agent. We buy the airplanes. We take all the risk. But also a fantastic opportunity. They, as an OEM, were really going places, and I could see that the market was growing in the UK. There's an opportunity to develop that brand in the UK and to just increase awareness of that product. So for me, that was building that safe haven. I learned a lot from the American businesses and how they actually structured their business. That's the safe haven. And from that safe haven, I could then start to be more entrepreneurial, or that was the plan.
Well, that's interesting because when we talk about business aviation in Monocle, often there is this difference. It's kind of like the USA and then everyone else. Mm-hmm. But it's instructive to me that you felt you could take your understanding of that market and apply it or overlay it or be informed by it when looking at the European space.
You mean the US market?
Yeah, because the dynamics are so different. And yet they're clearly, given your successes, are things you have very clearly identified. Are they also how not to do as well as how to do things, do you think?
I think that the whole infrastructure in the US is very different from Europe. So airports are public, for example. So the same as roads are public in this country. In American airports are public. So it's very, very different in Europe. And airports in most places in Europe, with the exception of France, but most places in Europe, airports are private. So they have to make money and they're a commercial business in their own right. So the model of airports is very different. And I think as a result of that, the cost base in Europe tends to be higher than it is in the US. And then I think from the customer's point of view, there is definitely a difference. So 70% or 80% of business aviation customers in the US, people who travel on business jets, are actually middle management. And that's surprising. People don't realize that. They always think of a business jet. They think it's the rich and the famous traveling around. That's absolutely not the case. And the US are so advanced in that. I think it's because it's the difficulty to travel to these smaller locations. I mean, the US air transportation network is very hub and spoke. So, they have large hubs where all the airliners connect through. So if you want to travel from secondary location to secondary location, you're either driving or you're taking the airline through a hub. And it's just quite onerous to travel. And I think that's why the US business aviation has just exploded. And I think in Europe, there's a slight cultural difference as well. I think the consumer in Europe, there's this perception that, that business aviation is seen as excessive and glamorous, and it's not seen as a business tool in quite the same way. And I think that's really what I'm passionate about changing, is that perception, because it is a business tool. And I've experienced that myself in business, with my own flying. I can get to all these places, without having to go through the major hubs. And when I had stores, in the retail business, I was going to all these small locations without having to go to the major international airports. So it is a productivity tool. And, I also used to fly, myself as a business aviation pilot. And we used to do multi-leg trips in one day, drop a passenger off, then fly somewhere else, and then get them all back home at night. And that's the thing. They could actually see their families. And without business aviation, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They'd have had to stay somewhere, stay overnight in a hotel, or maybe even 2 nights in a hotel, whereas you could do all that in one day. So there is a difference between the US and Europe. And I think it'd be nice to try to educate the European market that it really is a productivity tool. But it's hard to measure. And that's the difficulty because, of course, business aviation depends how you use it. But generally, yes, it is more costly than the airline or the car. but of course you're saving so much time, and it's how much value you place on your time and getting back to your family, getting home at night. It's those intangibles that you also have to factor in, and that's tricky to do.
Oh yeah, and I think we're getting more enlightened about the value of that time as this sort of premium metric to look at, not just in a business context, but generally. Talk to me a little bit about some of the superstars. So Pilatus is a brand that we've covered at Monocle, obviously, with our fascination with aviation and Swissness and so forth. I don't know, give me an example. PC-12, take me inside one of these aircraft. Tell me why it works so well, why you love it, why you want to be the guy that's selling these aircraft on and so forth here in this country. What's the USP maybe, and give us some of your personal feelings about it.
Yeah, so maybe just a little bit of history. So the Pilatus really built very tough utilitarian aircraft, and they also built military aircraft as well. And the story of the PC-12 really goes back to the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Australia. They needed a product that was fit for the outback, landing in those sort of in the bush, basically. So they needed a very rugged aeroplane that was large enough, had a big cargo door that they could get their patients in very, very easily without the wing getting in the way or bits of aircraft structure and all that sort of thing. And that's what Pilatus built. And they built the PC-12 really for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And then somebody looked at it and said, this could be a really cool executive transport. Put some leather seats in it, make it look a little bit more luxurious. And the rest is history. I think it's the fact that aircraft is so versatile. It really can do everything. And that's the amazing thing about it. There's always a compromise in aviation. It might not be the fastest aircraft. A jet is obviously faster. But door to door, so if you're trying to get from one destination to the other, your travel time could be significantly reduced simply because you can access airfields that are much closer to your final destination or your point of departure than you would be able to in a jet. And it's a large cabin, and that's the beauty of it. And it's very, very fuel efficient. So again, going back to the environmental argument, it's incredibly fuel efficient and relatively very, very green aircraft. And that's really the beauty. And I think, again, as you said, the Swissness of it, the Swiss quality, they take enormous pride in very, very high standards of manufacturing, and you can see that throughout the aeroplane.
We are back with the Curator, and now a highlight from my show, The Stack. What a pleasure to speak with David Di Benedetto, the Senior Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Garden and Gun, a title celebrating the American South.
I usually start by telling anyone who's not familiar with the magazine that it's not about gardens or guns. It is a Southern lifestyle magazine, and we can get into the name in a minute, but I'm fortunate enough to say that it's about everything that I love about the South, whether you're talking about its people, its stories, its culture. We certainly have a connection to the land. There's a sporting element to Garden and Gun. I hope that every issue is a bit of a surprise for folks in what they see, and also an introduction to, this land that we love.
Are you from the South itself?
Yes, I am from Savannah, Georgia. So we're based in Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah is about 2.5 hours south of here.
And one interesting thing about, especially perhaps the United States, that there are great magazines that are being made outside, the coasts. You don't need necessarily to be in LA or in New York. And that's fascinating, right?
It's a great point, right? Right out of college, I went to New York City and got a job as a fact checker at Men's Journal magazine, which was owned by Jan Wenner at the time. And I'd only ever wanted to be in magazines. So it was a dream, right? And I was in New York City working at Men's Journal and then Field and Stream, which was part of Time Inc. I wrote a book for HarperCollins. I never thought I would be able to leave New York City and go to a magazine of such quality and such content that I felt so familiar and proud of.
And it's interesting, we're talking about regional titles, but the United States is such a vast country. You're almost talking about a country. When you count population, the growth of states like, Florida, Texas, for example. So I think when we say regional, people sometimes might misunderstand what I mean with it.
It's a very good point, right? And what's interesting about Garden and Gun, while it is a Southern lifestyle magazine, I think it's 42% of our subscribers are outside of what we would consider the South. And New York and California are two very, very big states for us when it comes to subscribers. And we have about just around 400,000 subscribers.
And talking about subscribers, is that how the majority of your readers come across the magazine? Through subscriptions? Or do you still have quite a lot of kind of sales point across the region or across the country?
This magazine does really well on the newsstand, without getting into numbers. We do a number of percentage points better newsstand sell-through than a lot of magazines do. And, we're in Grand Central Station, we're in LAX, we're certainly, across the country. What's nice about that is when somebody finds us, we're kind of sticky. When they find us and maybe they're interested in traveling the South, outside of the South, or that arts issue, and they pick us up for the first time, we've got a pretty good turnover. We have a pretty good connection, I should say, and they become subscribers. And that's really nice. And those year over year subscribers, those numbers are really, really good too, which is a blessing. And also something that keeps me up at night, because you don't just get that. you got to work at it, and you don't want to lose it, right?
It takes time, even organic growth. I mean, to maintain, that's the hard part.
That's been a secret, right, to this magazine's success has been its grassroots growth. Our gifting program, which every magazine has a gifting program, but you can't imagine how many folks want to gift Garden and Gun, to their friends, and whether those are Southern friends or friends who live outside of the South, and they want them to understand this world that they so love.
And I think you're lucky as well in that sense, David, that I think the South, that area in the United States, is going through tremendous growth. A lot of migration, even within the country, right? Everybody's looking at that region in a way.
We often talk about the global South. Right. I mean, there's so many cultures that are coming and melding here and, taking, whether it's a Vietnamese dish, right, that then has a Southern spin put on it. That's exciting to me. Right. I mean, just taking some of these traditions and mixing them up a bit and growing what we know and growing, how we feel about them. It makes me tingle sometimes.
And I think we can review here that there's a new podcast series for Garden and Gun coming out soon.
Yeah,
right?
So I mentioned that, sporting that sort of the wing shooting and fly fishing, the higher end of the sporting world is part of Garden and Gun's DNA. And so I'm part of a podcast with a fellow contributor, T. Edward Nickens, called The Wild South. And we've spent the last 8 episodes where we interview icons in this world. And really what's been so neat, Fernando, is these folks who everyone knows so well, getting to understand how much they care about the environment and what they're doing to protect it, right? And understanding that connection to the natural world is how we get people to care about it. And so if we can do that, whether that's through fly fishing, hiking, river rafting, whatever it may be, if we can get people outside, we can get them to care. And, certainly we talk about the South, but it's a global issue, as you know. So it's been fun.
And it's interesting you mentioned fishing. I like fishing, actually, but
you do.
I just don't do it enough. It's a nice thing. Do you fish?
A lot. You could say I'm mildly obsessed.
You need to give me some tips after, David.
Yeah. I would love for you to come to Charleston and take you fishing. I would love it. I love nothing more than sharing my passion for fishing with others.
And this week, the menu, they sit down with TV chef, author and restaurateur Judy Ju to talk about how her heritage and the food she grew up eating have shaped the chef she is today.
Korean food is so wide and varied, and not only in terms of region, but also it's, we have 4 distinct seasons. So there are so many soups and stews because it gets bitterly cold. And so there's a long-standing tradition around that. And, we are harvesting from the mountains, the seas, it's a peninsula, everything from the ocean, from the, mountainous root vegetables that I've never seen before, from the valleys, etc. So every single time I go back to Korea, I am trying something that I've never seen before, like the wild and wacky, as well as, some just like super dynamic street food scenes that like all the wild and wacky stuff. And it's just incredibly fun. But Korean food, I feel like the greatest hits have all been discovered, things like Korean barbecue, you mentioned bulgogi, bibimbap, etc. And there's so much more to be discovered. And I feel like the soups and stews haven't been discovered yet. And there's so many great bubbling bowls and cauldrons of jjigaes, we call them, that hug you back and really warm you from the inside. And there are so many regional delicacies. So yeah, we've only just scratched the surface, of Korean food. And, Korea, we eat everything, we eat meat, we eat pork, we eat, beef, etc. So, and tons of seafood. So there isn't really anything banned for religious reasons or anything. So the food really, takes on a wide, variety. And also like high-end versus low-end. We have 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, and you can eat, royal cuisine. You can also eat vegan with the temple food, traditional Buddhist temple food, as well as, down and dirty on the street. Yeah.
Is there an element of regionality to your cuisine, or the cuisine that really speaks to your heart? Obviously, your parents come from different parts of the country. Mm-hmm. Did they kind of instill any sense of regionality in what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that my father is from what is now North Korea, and so he loves the traditional North Korean dishes, so these like cold noodle soups, these large dumplings and stuff. So we grew up eating a lot of that. So I think that I'm very familiar with some of the most loved dishes from the North. My mom is from just outside of Seoul. And, she doesn't like her kimchi too funky or too spicy, whereas if you go down south, it gets funkier, it gets spicier, it gets, fishier. So her palate's a little bit more mild, but I have to say, I love it down south where, like bring on the funk, bring on the noise, bring on all of those big flavors. Like it just like punches you in the face and stuff. So, I have to say, I probably have diverged a bit from my parents' palate a little bit because I love all of those deep, complex, umami-filled flavors from the south.
Here in London, you used to run Jinju, and then you decided to move into this new concept, which is Soulbird. One was fancier, I suppose.
Yes.
Soulbird very much speaks to,
Yes, exactly.
the more
Yes.
comforting aspect, of course, of food.
Yes.
Why the change? And can you tell us more about your plans for what's next?
Yeah, so I had 3 locations of Jinju. I had 2 in London and 1 in Hong Kong. And it was just time to move on. I wasn't getting along with my business partner that well. And so, it was very amicable, but, we're just like, let's just agree to disagree. And we just split ways. And, we just, we closed 2 of them, and he kept Soho open for a while. And that one actually just closed, but it was just time to move on. And sometimes you just have to like close chapters, And then I decided with my other business partner to open up Soulbird, just because we've had this cult following of our Korean fried chicken. And we decided it deserved its own concept. And we felt that there wasn't anything in the quick serve space that was catering or focused in Korean food. And we felt that there was a gap in the market. And, just like, why don't we just do something that is like kind of more simple, streamlined, open up a bunch of them and eventually sell it. Yeah.
Well, what makes Soulbird's chicken so extraordinary? What is the secret to the specific chicken that you do there?
It's a classic Korean fried chicken. So it is made with the wet batter. And because of that, it has this like kind of thin, very crispy, like cracking shell, which, Korean fried chicken has also in the past been nicknamed like stained glass chicken because you get that like nice crispy crunch, or like eggshell chicken. So it's a double frying technique too. So we're definitely employing that like kind of unusual technique that you don't see a lot, And we also have like our great umami-filled sauces, that are really grounded in, Korea's like cornerstone flavors. So gochujang, which is a fermented chili paste, and soy sauce, which is for, obviously like fermented soybeans, and just, infused with like garlic and onions and ginger, and just kind of, tossing it in that and taking it mainstream.
And now finally a highlight from Monocle Design. Over the past 10 years, the British Caribbean artist and designer Samuel Ross has collaborated with industry leaders such as Nike and Apple, showcased work at galleries including White Cube in London, and been awarded an MBE for services to fashion. Let's hear from Samuel.
The past few years it was more so the title of multidisciplinary designer, and at the moment it seems to be multi-hyphenate, which is kind of being flung around quite a bit. But I honestly believe that, when one decides to kind of dedicate yourself to the creative arts, you need to have these different levers, right? For the most part, some of those are commercial levers, which tend to fall under the remit of service design and commercial work. And on the other side, it's more so just this innate desire to be able to contribute into the, future index of the history of the arts. And I kind of look at it more so as church and state, where with the arts, it's a complete expression of self. And when it comes to design, it's really the gift of servitude.
That's quite fascinating. So you're quite clear on there are distinct boundaries, and it really comes down to who you're working for.
Absolutely. And I think that, a good example of that would be the partnerships with, say, LVMH, Acqua di Parma or Hublot, where you can see that there is a fractal of the language that I've developed in my fine art practice, which is almost amplified for a slightly more easier, palatable gesture, you could say, to the audience.
Which is where that service element comes in, because it's no longer about you. It's certainly inspired by you, but it's really ultimately about other people.
It's about reach. It's about, finding ways to simply have like a micro or macro moment of elation with an audience base, and to hopefully bring up some questions. When you have like a relatively strong design language, you could say, whether it's color or shape or texture or material, there's always this line you have to toe of ensuring that there's enough newness as you work in the commercial sector and spaces cross-category, without also diluting down the essence of what is fundamentally interesting about a practice. So by throwing these slightly more abstract partnerships into the mix, you continue to produce this counterweight of newness, I'd say. And there's also this idea of challenge, which is really interesting within design. If I think back to how, my first company at Cold Wall became closer to a technical sportswear brand, it was through an independent partnership that I took with Oakley in 2018. And that partnership was purely about learning how to work with technical materials and being able to open up new relationships with milliners and vendors such as Lamintas or Omlatex or Mayoki or Komatsu in Tokyo. And there was this learning which then, trickled back into a Cold Wall, and then we have a Cold Wall as a technical luxury sportswear brand. It's quite similar when it comes to the tertiary elements of engineering, you could say, hence why the partnership with Codership is also an onboarding of skills for our small studio.
Let's talk a little bit about SRA and the studio. What's the scope of your work?
Sure. I think the main top-line view we have is the beautification of industrial processes in industrial design. And really, at the moment, there's more so a focus on hard luxury goods for the most part. That doesn't mean that we don't spend as much time working with, say, Generation Press, who, of course, are an incredible lithographic printer in the UK, Paul Hewitt, who we've produced a lot of material with, which is on a much smaller scale. It's this idea that luxury and price don't necessarily need to live in the same space or room. It's more so a sensibility and a cadence. The main focus of the studio at this point is, of course, to be a service-based design studio. Over the next year, really, you will start to see there be a shift into a D2C model, from the studio becoming much more of a atelier and a brand. And another reason I really wanted to start the studio now 4 years ago, which was started at the Serpentine Hublot Design Prize, was to make sure that there is a relationship and a rapport between local independent manufacturing within the UK, but also global vendors, to more so compete against this idea of synthetic work processes that, of course, are a necessity for PLCs and for entities of scale. But when you're really thinking about the value being about craft and sensibility and sensuality and slightly more esoteric prospects, it's about the intimacy of the relationships held with vendors and producers and artisans and craftspeople.
It's not just about the actual product at the end, it's about the process. So is having the right makers involved key? Tell us a little bit about how you're redesigning that.
This notion, and I guess that's what I was trying to get at with the focus on, say, working with and having brilliant architects who all come from AA school or RCA for the most part into the SRA studio, but then also having these deeply close relationships with UK print producers and makers. It's about the articulation and sensitivity in each of these disciplines. SRA isn't a catch-all. As I said, I'm an artist and a designer, so we don't try to do all by our hand, but we do try to work with the best in field for the most part, who understand the cadences of their fields. There's also this matter of trying to rightly balance expression through aesthetics, but also open up new means of manufacturing.
and we've touched on it a little bit, but your priorities as a designer and artist over the next 12 months, where's your energy being focused? What are some of the concerns you're looking to address?
I am really focused on, I think, housing the body remains an absolute focus, whether that's through garment or whether that's through public space, whether that's through apparel and footwear. There's a real focus on being able to democratize the idea of sensibility and the idea of taste. And I think that will become a little bit more clear over the next 12 months. I'm also absolutely focused. One of the real mission statements of SRA is to make sure that, to be honest, British design and artists stay on the forefront of global conversations. Hence why it's a real focus for us to have at least 1 to 2 global collaborations in Asia Pacific and North America at all times annually to make sure that we do stay part of the wider conversation. And the third component I'd say I'm interested in, I'm still deeply inspired by the power of design in public space and the questioning that can come about. My father's a stained glass artisan who studied at CSM and did his MA in glass technology in Leicester, and he spends a lot of time procuring stained glass windows for old cathedrals and churches globally. But I remember the first time that he took me to see the Henry Moore sculpture in Kensington Gardens as a child, and all these questions came to mind, such as who, what, when, why, how. And it stuck with me, and I want to be able to deliver that type of experience for others, to be able to look at things in a slightly more esoteric way if they maybe haven't had the opportunity to go through the schooling and whatnot. So that is also a very nice segue into the Black British Artist Grants Programme, which will continue to provide British artists with funding independently on behalf of SRA annually. And we've just added in the King's Foundation this year, the Royal College of Art, and Serpentine will likely be also joining this year.
And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by San Impi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week, and thank you for listening.